She thought she knew her family, until the truth behind her life is exposed, a story of resilience and hope that will touch your heart. Welcome back. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and enjoy the story. The Crystal. Flute of champagne slipped from Nancy's fingers, shattering against the terracotta patio tiles, with a sound that perfectly mirrored the fracturing of her world. 60 years of certainty, of knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged, vanished in an instant. The elegant garden party her children had so lovingly arranged for her birthday continued around her, friends laughing, grandchildren chasing each other between tables adorned with her favorite golden roses, vintage photo frames displaying snapshots of a life she now questioned. But Nancy herself had frozen, the words she'd just overheard from her cousin Florence hanging in the air between them. She isn't even blood family. Nancy's daughter Fiona rushed over, concern etched into her features. "Mom, are you okay?" "Just clumsy," Nancy managed, forcing her lips into what she hoped resembled a smile. Too much excitement for an old woman. But inside, a tempest was brewing. 60 years of believing she was the biological daughter of Samuel and Catherine Davis, respected fixtures of their small coastal town of Newport. 60 years of stories about how she had her father's eyes, her mother's delicate hands. 60 years of lies. Through some miracle of composure, Nancy continued with the celebration, accepting congratulations and well-wishes with practiced grace. Her social skills, honed through decades of community volunteerism and charity galas, served as her armor now. But each embrace felt hollow, each kind word a reminder of the foundation crumbling beneath her feet. Her gaze kept drifting to Florence, now huddled with Nancy's older sister Deborah in the far corner of the garden, their furtive glances confirming what she already knew. There was truth in what she'd overheard. As the last guests departed and twilight settled over the coastal property, Nancy found herself alone on the veranda, staring out at the darkening ocean. The rhythmic pulse of waves against the shore had always calmed her, but tonight they seemed to mock her with their constancy, while her own identity had become as shifting and uncertain as the sand beneath the tide. "Mum?" It was her son, Gordon, the youngest of her 3 children. At 38, he still possessed the sensitivity that had defined him since childhood. "Everyone's gone. Fiona took the kids home, and Adam's helping clean up. Are you sure you're all right?" Nancy turned to face her son, wondering if she could see any resemblance between them now, or if that too had been merely wishful thinking all these years. His concerned eyes, had she ever truly inherited her father's gaze, or had that been part of the fabrication? "I need to speak with Aunt Deborah before she leaves," Nancy said, her voice steadier than she felt. Gordon hesitated. "She already left, Mom. Said she was feeling tired after all the excitement." Of course she had. Nancy recognized avoidance when she saw it. After all, hadn't her entire life apparently been constructed around it? "Then I'll see her tomorrow," Nancy replied, a new determination forming within her. "There are some family matters we need to discuss." The night passed in sleepless contemplation. Nancy paced the halls of her home, touching photographs, examining her reflection in mirrors, searching for clues she might have missed. By dawn, as golden light spilled across her carefully tended garden, Nancy had made a decision. She would uncover the truth no matter how painful. She owed that much to herself after 60 years of unwitting deception. Deborah's elegant Victorian home stood as a testament to old money and careful preservation, much like the secrets she apparently kept. When Nancy arrived unannounced that morning, her sister answered the door still in her dressing gown, her silver hair twisted into a loose bun, surprise and something like dread flickering across her features. "Nancy, it's barely 8. "I heard what Florence said yesterday," Nancy interrupted, stepping past her sister into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "About me not being blood family. I need to know what she meant, Deborah, and I need to hear it from you." The silence that stretched between them confirmed everything before Deborah even spoke. When she finally did, her voice was soft with regret. "Let me make us some tea." This isn't a conversation for the doorway. Seated in Deborah's sunroom, surrounded by blooming orchids, and the delicate china their mother had cherished, Nancy listened as 60 years of careful fiction unraveled. Yes, she had been adopted as an infant. Yes, Deborah had known since she was 12 years old. Yes, their parents had sworn her to secrecy, believing it better for Nancy to never know the truth. They loved you so completely, Deborah insisted, tears gathering in her eyes. From the moment they brought you home, you were theirs in every way that mattered. Mother used to say that some children grow under their mother's heart and others grow in it. You grew in hers. Nancy's own heart felt leaden in her chest. You had no right to keep this from me. None of you did. It was a different time, Nancy. People didn't discuss adoption openly the way they do now. Mother and father thought they were protecting you. From what? From knowing who I really am? From having any connection to my actual origins? That wasn't protection, Deborah. That was control. The harshness of her words seemed to physically impact her sister, who flinched and set down her teacup with trembling hands. There might be some things in Mother's desk. After she passed, Father asked me to keep certain papers, in case you ever discovered the truth. I've kept them all these years, though I prayed you'd never need them. An hour later, Nancy sat, alone in her sister's study, a weathered manila envelope open before her. Inside lay adoption papers dated February 1962, legal documents transferring parental rights from an agency in the Blue Ridge Mountains to Samuel and Catherine Davis of Newport, Rhode Island. Attached was a faded photograph of a young woman standing before a misty mountain landscape, her face partly obscured by the brim of a hat, but her posture straight and proud. There was no name written on the back, no clue as to whether this was Nancy's birth mother or simply a procedural photograph included in the file. The papers revealed only bare facts. Nancy had been born in a small village called Hazelwood in the Blue Ridge Mountains, to a mother who was just 19 years old and unable to provide for her child. There was no mention of a father, no medical history, nothing that might help Nancy understand where she had truly come from. She carefully returned the documents to the envelope, along with the mysterious photograph. "I'll be keeping these," she informed Deborah, who had hovered anxiously in the doorway. "And I'll be looking for answers, real ones." "Nancy, please. What good can come from digging up the past? Mother and father gave you a beautiful life. Isn't that enough?" Nancy looked at her sister, the sister who had shared parents with her but not blood, who had kept this secret for nearly 50 years, who still believed in protecting her from her own truth. "No," she said simply, "it isn't. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you." Continuing. The following weeks saw Nancy withdraw from her usual social engagements. The weekly bridge club, the museum board meetings, the volunteer shifts at the hospital, all were set aside as she immersed herself in a world of genealogy websites, ancestry forums, and historical newspaper archives. Her dining room table disappeared, beneath stacks of printouts and notebooks filled with possibilities and dead ends. Her children noticed the change immediately. Nancy, who had always been the epitome of organization and structure, now lived in a chaotic space of obsession. Meals were forgotten, phone calls went unreturned, and her normally immaculate home showed signs of neglect. It was so unlike her that Fiona began stopping by daily, ostensibly to bring groceries or help tidy up, but really to monitor her mother's increasingly concerning behavior. "Mum, I'm worried about you," Fiona admitted one afternoon, gently removing a cold cup of coffee Nancy had forgotten hours earlier. "You're not sleeping, you're barely eating. This isn't healthy." Nancy looked up from her computer screen, where she'd been searching through digitized hospital records from the Blue Ridge region. The artificial light cast harsh shadows across her face, emphasizing the fatigue etched there. "I'm trying to find myself, Fiona, the real me. Surely you can understand why that's important." Fiona sighed, taking a seat beside her mother. At 43, she had inherited Nancy's practical nature, or so they had always believed. Now even that connection felt questionable. "Of course, it's important. But you already know who you are. You're Nancy Davis Crawford. You're my mother, Gordon and Adam's mother, grandmother to 5 amazing kids. You're the woman who organized flood relief after Hurricane Alice, who taught me how to make your famous peach cobbler, who never missed a single one of our school events growing up. That's who you are." Nancy reached out to squeeze her daughter's hand. "I know you mean well, sweetheart, but please try to understand. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my medical history, my heritage, the traits I believed I'd inherited, it's all built on quicksand. Don't I deserve to know where I really came from? You came from the people who raised you and loved. You," Fiona insisted, frustration edging her voice. "Why isn't that enough?" It was the same question Deborah had asked, and Nancy still had no satisfactory answer. How could she explain the visceral need to know, the sense that an essential piece of herself had been kept hidden? How could she articulate the betrayal she felt each time she looked at old family photographs, recognizing now the subtle differences that should have been obvious: her chestnut hair among a family of blondes, her creative temperament in a household of practical minds? Instead of trying, Nancy changed the subject. "Did you bring those courthouse records from your friend at the Historical Society?" Fiona sighed but produced a manila envelope from her bag. "Yes, but Mom, these are from 60 years ago. Most of the people involved are probably—" "Thank you," Nancy interrupted, already reaching for the documents. "This means a lot to me." Alone again that evening, Nancy pored over the fragmented information she'd gathered. The adoption had been arranged through a now-defunct agency called New Beginnings Family Services, which had operated throughout the Appalachian region in the 1950s and early 1960s. Most of their records had been lost in a fire in 1978, according to an elderly clerk Nancy had spoken with by phone. Another dead end. But among the courthouse documents Fiona had brought, Nancy found something unexpected. A birth certificate application with her original name struck through and replaced with Nancy Elizabeth Davis. The original name, partially visible beneath, the marking appeared to read Elizabeth Grace Thornton. Thornton. A name. Her name. Nancy felt a rush of emotion so powerful she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. For the first time since her birthday party 3 weeks ago, she had something concrete, something real that connected her to her origins. That night, Nancy dreamed of mountains shrouded in mist, of a young woman with chestnut hair like her own, standing at a crossroads. When she woke, tears dampened her pillow, but a new sense of purpose filled her heart. She would find the Thorntons of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She would discover who Elizabeth Grace Thornton had been and why she had given up her baby daughter. The search led her to online forums dedicated to Appalachian genealogy and history. Nancy created accounts, posted inquiries, and spent hours scrolling through responses and suggestions. Most led nowhere, but one message from a local historian in Hazelwood caught her attention. The Thorntons were known for their textile work, especially quilting. The local museum has a collection of Thornton quilts dating back to the 1920s. The craftsmanship is distinctive, intricate patterns incorporating local plants and symbols. If you're researching this family, the textiles might provide some clues. Nancy stared at the screen, a strange sensation washing over her. Textiles, quilting. All her life, she had possessed an inexplicable talent and passion for textile arts. Neither Samuel nor Catherine Davis had shown any interest or ability in this area, something Nancy had always considered a curious anomaly. Her hands trembled as she typed a response, requesting more information about the museum collection. That evening, when Adam stopped by with dinner from Nancy's favorite Italian restaurant, he found his mother at her sewing machine for the first time in weeks, fabric spread across her lap, her expression more peaceful than he'd seen since her birthday. "You're sewing again," he observed, setting down the bag of food. At 45, Adam was her eldest, the most pragmatic of her children, and the one who had been most skeptical about Nancy's search. "That's good to see." Nancy looked up, a smile touching her lips. "Did you know that my talents might actually be genetic? The Thorntons, my biological family, were apparently skilled textile artists." Adam's expression tightened. "Mom, you don't know that these people are related to you. You've found a name and you're making connections that might not exist." "But they might," Nancy countered undeterred. "Don't you see how significant this could be? All my life I've wondered where my artistic abilities came from. Your grandfather could barely thread a needle, and your grandmother's idea of crafting was arranging flowers someone else had grown. Adam sighed, unpacking the containers of pasta and salad. I just don't want to see you get hurt, following trails that lead nowhere. And honestly, Mum, it's a little hurtful to hear you talk as if Dad and Grandma and Grandpa weren't your real family. Nancy set aside her sewing and joined her son at the table. They were my family, Adam. They always will be. But they kept something fundamental from me, knowledge that was my right to have. I need to understand why, and I need to know who else I am. Adam served the food in silence, his disapproval evident in the tense line of his shoulders. Finally, he said, Gordon, Fiona and I have been talking. We think you should consider speaking to Dr. Mercer about this. Nancy stiffened. My therapist? You think I need therapy because I want to know my own origins. We think you're becoming obsessed in a way that isn't healthy, Adam clarified, his tone gentle but firm. You've changed, Mom. You're withdrawing from friends, neglecting your home, fixating on people who gave you up 60 years ago while pushing away the family who's right here. The words stung, partly because Nancy recognized the truth in them. She had been consumed by her search, sometimes at the expense of present relationships. But Adam's characterization of her birth family felt unfair. We don't know that I was given up, she said quietly. We don't know the circumstances at all. That's part of what I'm trying to discover. And what if what you discover is painful? What if your birth mother was just a teenager who made a mistake and wanted to forget it ever happened? What then? The possibility had occurred to Nancy, of course. Each night as she lay awake, her mind conjured scenarios ranging from tragic to mundane. A young woman forced by circumstance to relinquish her child, a family scandal hushed through adoption, a mother who simply didn't want the responsibility of parenthood. Any or none might be true. Then at least I'll know, she told her son. Knowledge is better than lies, Adam, even when it hurts. They ate the remainder of their meal in uneasy silence, the gap between them widening with each unspoken thought. After Adam left, Nancy returned to her sewing machine, running her fingers over the patterns she'd created, wondering if somewhere, in her DNA, the hands of Thornton women had guided her without her knowing. 2.5 months into her search, Nancy's perseverance yielded its first significant breakthrough. An email arrived from the Hazelwood Historical Society, responding to her inquiries about the Thornton family. Dear Mrs. Crawford, after reviewing our archives, we've confirmed that a woman named Glyza Thornton gave birth at Hazelwood Community Hospital in January 1962. According to our records, she was unmarried and came from a family of traditional textile artisans in the Pigeon Ridge area. The Thorntons were known for their distinctive quilting patterns, which incorporated local flora and Appalachian symbols. We have limited personal information about Ms. Thornton, but our archives indicate she moved to Asheville shortly after her hospital stay. If you're researching this family for genealogical purposes, you might find more information through the Asheville Public Records Office. Attached, please find a digital copy of a newspaper clipping mentioning a Thornton family quilting exhibition from 1961, which includes a photograph that might be of interest. Sincerely, Margaret Wilkins, Archivist, Hazelwood Historical Society. With trembling fingers, Nancy opened the attachment. There, in grainy black and white, was a photograph of several women standing proudly beside displayed quilts. The caption identified them as members of the Thornton family, with first names listed. And there, second from the right, was a young woman identified as Glyza Thornton, 18. Though the image was of poor quality, Nancy could see the similarities. Immediately, the same heart-shaped face, the same slight tilt to the head that Nancy's own children had teased her about in photographs. Glyza, her mother's name. Nancy whispered it aloud, testing the sound of it. This name that should have been part of her history. A quick search confirmed her suspicion. Glyza was an uncommon variation of Eliza with Appalachian roots. The newspaper clipping mentioned the Thorntons' reputation for intricate quilting patterns passed down through generations. One quilt in particular, made by Glyza, was highlighted for its innovative design incorporating traditional Cherokee motifs, a nod to the family's alleged distant Native American ancestry. Nancy sat back, overwhelmed by this sudden connection to a heritage she had never known existed. All her life, she had been drawn to textile arts, spending hours designing and creating pieces that combined traditional patterns with her own innovations. She had always assumed it was simply a personal interest, developed through classes and practice. But what if it had been in her blood all along? What if her hands had been following patterns written in her very DNA? With renewed energy, Nancy began researching Asheville records from the early 1960s. If Gliza had moved there after giving birth, perhaps she had left more traces of her life. It was while cross-referencing business licenses that Nancy discovered something that made her heart skip. A small tailor shop called Thornton's Fine. Alterations had operated in downtown Asheville from 1963 to 1992. The owner was listed as G. Thornton. The realization hit Nancy with stunning clarity. Her birth mother had lived just 3 hours away from Newport for decades. While Nancy was growing up in coastal privilege, attending private schools and debutante balls, learning to sail and play tennis, Gliza Thornton had been living a completely different life in the mountains, running a small business, perhaps wondering about the daughter she had given up. Had they ever unknowingly crossed paths? Had Gliza ever traveled to Newport? Had Nancy ever visited Asheville during family vacations? The possibilities haunted her, these invisible threads that might have momentarily connected them without either knowing. The day wore well into evening as Nancy searched for more information about Thornton's Fine alterations. She discovered a small feature in a 1978 local business magazine describing the shop as renowned for exquisite handiwork and attention to detail, especially in bridal alterations and heirloom restorations. The article mentioned that G. Thornton had trained under master seamstresses and had developed techniques for preserving antique textiles that attracted clients from across the Southeast. Nancy found herself wondering if her own fastidious nature, the precision that had made her an excellent event organizer and community leader, had come from this woman. Had Gliza passed down not only her talent with textiles, but also her meticulous attention to detail? Just as she was about to turn away from her computer, exhausted but exhilarated by these discoveries, one more search result caught her eye. It was a digitized program from a 1985 textile arts workshop at an Asheville community college. Listed among the instructors was Gliza Thornton, teaching traditional Appalachian quilting techniques and their modern applications. A dangerous hope began to bloom in Nancy's heart. If Gliza had been teaching as recently as 1985, and her business had operated until 1992, there was a chance, slim but real, that she might still be alive. At 78, she would be elderly but not impossibly old. For the first time, Nancy allowed herself to imagine a meeting, looking into the face of the woman who had given her life, asking the questions that had consumed her these past months, perhaps finding some closure to the mystery of her beginnings. Wait, is it possible? Could her biological mother still be out there, possibly wondering about the daughter she gave up all those years ago? Nancy felt her heart race as she contemplated what this might mean, not just for her search, but for her future. What would she even say to Gliza if she found her? What answers could possibly fill the void of 60 years of separation? 2 nights later, Nancy sat in her car outside Gordon's house, trying to gather her courage. Of her 3 children, her youngest had been the most supportive of her search, offering a sympathetic ear without judgment. Tonight, she needed that understanding more than ever, because she had made a decision that would likely upset the entire family. Gordon opened the door before she could knock, his expression shifting from welcome to concern as he took in her appearance. Nancy knew she looked different. She'd barely slept in days, and the emotional toll of her discoveries had left visible marks. "Mum, come in. I was just making dinner. Have you eaten?" Nancy allowed herself to be guided into the warm kitchen, where Gordon's 2 daughters were setting the table. At 10 and 12, Emma and Lily were at the age where their grandmother had always been a fixed point in their universe, reliable, unchanging. Now they regarded her with curious eyes, sensing something different in her demeanor. "Girls, why don't you go watch TV while I talk with Grandma?" Gordon suggested, and the children departed with only minor grumbling. Once they were alone, Gordon poured 2 glasses of wine and sat across from Nancy at the kitchen island. "You've found something, haven't you?" Nancy nodded, then took a steadying breath. "I'm going to Hazelwood, Gordon. I've booked a flight for next week. I need to see where I was born, to walk the streets where Gleaser lived. I need to feel that connection." Gordon was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. Unlike his siblings, he had never tried to dissuade Nancy from her search, perhaps because of his own experience as the family's perpetual seeker. Before settling into architecture, he had explored 3 different careers, traveled extensively, and even lived in an ashram for 6 months in his 20s. He understood the need to find one's place in the world. "Do you want company?" he asked finally. "I could take some time off. Go with you." The offer touched Nancy deeply. "Thank you, sweetheart. But this is something I need to do alone. At least this first time." Gordon nodded, accepting her decision without challenge. "Adam and Fiona won't like it. I know. That's why I came to you first. I was hoping you might help them understand." "I'll try, Mum. But you know how they are. Adam thinks everything can be resolved with a logical argument, and Fiona can't stand anything that disrupts her idea of how things should be." He smiled wryly. "They're both more like Dad that way." Nancy felt a pang at the mention of her late husband, Harold. He had passed 5 years earlier after a brief but fierce battle with pancreatic cancer, leaving her to navigate widowhood, just as she'd been preparing for their retirement adventures. Would Harold have supported her search, or would he have been as resistant as Adam and Fiona? She would never know. "Your father loved you all so completely," she said softly. "DNA never mattered to him. You were his children in every way that counted. Just like you were Grandma and Grandpa's daughter," Gordon pointed out gently. "Yet here you are." Nancy acknowledged the parallel with a slight nod. "The difference is that you all grew up knowing your true origins. You never had to question who you were or where you came from." "Fair enough." Gordon reached across the island to squeeze her hand. "When do you leave?" "Next Tuesday. I'll be gone for a week, maybe longer depending on what I find." "And what exactly are you hoping to find, Mom? Have you thought about what happens if you actually locate Gleaser? What would you say to her?" It was the question Nancy had been asking herself for days. What did she want from this journey? Understanding, connection, answers to questions she wasn't even sure how to articulate. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me just wants to see her, to know that she exists. Part of me has 1,000 questions about why she gave me up, whether it was her choice, if she ever thought about me afterward. And part of me is terrified that finding her will somehow diminish what I had with Mom and Dad, with Catherine and Samuel," she corrected. Herself, still adjusting to this new way of thinking about her parents, Gordon considered her words. "I think you need to prepare yourself for any outcome. She might not want to be found, she might not even be alive, or she might have been hoping for this moment for 60 years. There's just no way to know." Nancy nodded, grateful for his balanced perspective. "That's why I have to go. Even if all I discover is where I was born and something about the Thornton family, it's more than I have now." They talked for another hour, making practical arrangements for Nancy's absence. Gordon would check on her house, Fiona would take over her commitments at the Historical Society, and Adam, once he'd been convinced, would handle any financial matters that arose. By the time Nancy left, she felt more settled in her decision, bolstered by her son's support. The conversation with her other children went largely as expected. Fiona was concerned about Nancy traveling alone at her age. "I'm 60, not 90, Nancy had retorted, while Adam presented logical arguments against chasing ghosts and disrupting everyone's lives for a wild goose chase. But in the end, both grudgingly accepted that Nancy was determined, with or without their blessing. The night before her departure, Nancy sat alone in her sewing room, finishing a project she had started weeks earlier but abandoned in the chaos of her search. It was a small quilt, designed in a pattern she had created herself. or so she had always thought. Now, looking at the arrangement of stars and mountain peaks, she wondered if she had unconsciously echoed designs she had never seen, patterns that might have been in her blood all along. As she made the final stitches, Nancy felt a curious blend of excitement and trepidation. Tomorrow she would begin a journey into her past, seeking answers to questions she had never known to ask. Whatever she discovered in the mountains of North Carolina, she knew with certainty that her life would never be quite the same again. The flight to Asheville was smooth, the April sky clear and blue above the clouds. Nancy had always enjoyed flying, appreciating the perspective it provided. Problems that loomed large on the ground often seemed smaller from 30,000 feet. Today, however, her mind was too preoccupied with what awaited her to find philosophical comfort in altitude. She had reserved a room at a small bed and breakfast in Hazelwood, a 20-minute drive from the Asheville airport. As the rental car wound through the mountain roads, Nancy felt an unexpected familiarity with the landscape. She had never visited this region before, yet something about the blue-hazed ridges and rhododendron-lined slopes resonated within her. Was it possible that the scenery of her earliest days, glimpsed through an infant's unfocused eyes, had imprinted itself somehow in her subconscious? Hazelwood proved to be a picturesque small town, nestled at the foot of mountains so ancient they had worn down to gentle slopes rather than jagged peaks. The main street featured the kind of locally owned shops and cafes that larger towns had, lost to chain stores decades earlier. Nancy drove slowly, trying to imagine how it might have looked 60 years ago when a young Gleaser Thornton had walked these same streets. The Mountain Vista Inn welcomed Nancy with warm hospitality and a room that overlooked the town square. After unpacking, she set out on foot, her first destination the Hazelwood Historical Society, housed in a converted Victorian home at the edge of downtown. Margaret Wilkins, the archivist who had corresponded with Nancy, had agreed to meet her there despite it being a Sunday, when the building was normally closed to visitors. Margaret proved to be a lively woman in her 70s, with silver hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that sparkled with intelligence behind tortoiseshell glasses. "Mrs. Crawford, I'm so pleased you made the journey. When you first contacted Gus about the Thorntons, I never imagined you'd come all this way." "Please call me Nancy," she replied, shaking the archivist's hand, "and thank you for making time to see me today. Your email was incredibly helpful in my research." Margaret led her into a room lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves, the pleasant, musty scent of old paper filling the air. "I've pulled everything we have on the Thornton family, though I should warn you it's not extensive. Small-town record-keeping wasn't always as thorough as we might wish, especially for unmarried mothers and adopted babies." Nancy C. supplied gently. Margaret nodded, looking relieved that Nancy had addressed the subject directly. "Exactly. Those situations were handled quite differently in the early 60s, often with as little documentation as possible to protect everyone's privacy or reputation, depending on how you view it. I understand. I'm grateful for anything you can show me." For the next 2 hours, Nancy carefully examined the materials. Margaret had assembled local newspaper clippings mentioning textile exhibitions where Thornton quilts had won prizes, a high school yearbook from 1960 with Gleiser's senior portrait, church records noting Thornton family attendance and contributions, and a few photographs from community events showing women who might have been Nancy's maternal relatives. The yearbook provided the most immediate connection. Gleaser Thornton's 17-year-old face looked out from the page, serious but with a hint of mischief in her eyes. The resemblance to Nancy's own high school photos was striking. The same heart-shaped face, the same slight dimple in the left cheek when she smiled. Beneath the photo, Gleiser's activities were listed: Art Club, Home Economics Club, and Appalachian Heritage Society. Her ambition was recorded as to become a textile conservator and preserve our mountain traditions. "She was quite talented," Margaret commented, noticing Nancy's fixation on the portrait. The Thorntons were known for their skills with fabric and thread. Some said they could tell a family's entire history just by examining their quilts, which stitches were used, how the patterns were arranged, what fabrics were incorporated. It was almost like a language to them. Nancy thought of her own intuitive understanding of textiles, how she could often determine a garment's age and origin just by feeling the weight of the fabric or examining the construction. Another inheritance she hadn't known she possessed. "Do you know what happened to her after she left Hazelwood?" Nancy asked, careful to keep her tone casual as if this were merely academic interest rather than a deeply personal quest. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "You're not just researching genealogy, are you, Nancy? There's a more personal connection here." Nancy hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I have reason to believe that Gleaser Thornton was my birth mother. I was adopted as an infant, and my birth certificate originated here in Hazelwood." The archivist's eyes widened slightly, but she showed no judgment. "I see. Well, that certainly explains your interest." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I don't know much about Gleaser's life after she left, except that she established herself in Asheville. But there is someone who might know more. Hazel Walker. She runs the fabric shop on Main Street, Mountain Threads. The Walker and Thornton families were close for generations, and Hazel was about Gleaser's age. If anyone in town would have kept track of her, it would be Hazel." After leaving the Historical Society with copies of several documents, Nancy made her way to Mountain Threads. The shop window displayed vibrant quilts and bolts of fabric organized by color, creating a rainbow effect that drew the eye. A bell chimed softly as Nancy entered, and an elderly woman looked up from behind the counter, where she was measuring fabric for another customer. "Be with you in just a moment," she called, her accent carrying the distinctive lilt of the mountains. Nancy browsed the shop while waiting, her fingers automatically assessing the quality of the materials, appreciating the careful curation of patterns and textures. The place felt immediately familiar, as if she had visited it in dreams. When the other customer departed, Nancy approached the counter. "Are you Hazel Walker?" "I am," the woman confirmed, her keen eyes studying Nancy with interest. "And you're not from around here, though?" She paused, her head tilting slightly. "There's something familiar about you." Nancy took a deep breath. "My name is Nancy Crawford. I'm looking for information about the Thornton family, specifically Gleaser Thornton. Margaret at the Historical Society suggested you might be able to help me." Hazel's expression shifted, a complex mixture of surprise, caution, and what might have been recognition crossing her weathered features. "Gleaser Thornton," she repeated slowly. "Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in quite some time. May I ask why you're interested in her?" "I have reason to believe she might be my birth mother," Nancy replied, her heart pounding. The impact of Nancy's words was immediate. Hazel's hands froze on the fabric she'd been absently straightening, and her eyes widened as they swept over Nancy's face with new attention. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, reaching for the counter's edge to steady herself. "I should have seen it right away. You have her smile, her way of holding yourself. You're Gleaser's baby girl." Nancy felt her knees weaken. After months of searching, of piecing together fragments of information, to have someone simply look at her and recognize her lineage was overwhelming. She sank onto a nearby stool, grateful for its support. "Then it's true? You knew her? You knew she had a child?" Hazel nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Nancy's face. "I knew. The whole town knew, though folks didn't talk about it openly. Back then, an unmarried girl expecting was scandal enough to keep tongues wagging for months. Can you tell me about her? What was she like? Why did she—" Nancy couldn't finish the question, the words catching painfully in her throat. "Give you up?" Hazel completed gently. "That's not a simple story, and not one for the shop floor. Let me close early today. We can go to my house for tea and I'll tell you what I know." 20 minutes later, Nancy sat in Hazel's cozy living room, a cup of mountain herb tea warming her hands as she listened to the elderly woman's recollections. "Gleaser and I grew up together, thick as thieves from kindergarten on," Hazel began. "Both our families had been in these mountains for generations. The Thorntons were known for their textile work, quilting, sewing, weaving. Gleaser had the gift stronger than most. Her hands could coax beauty from the most ordinary fabrics. Nancy thought of her own sewing room at home, filled with creations she had always attributed to lessons and practice rather than inherited talent. She had dreams bigger than Hazelwood, Hazel continued. Wanted to study textile conservation at college, preserve the old mountain patterns and techniques. She had even been accepted to a program in Raleigh with a partial scholarship. Then, the summer after graduation, she met a young man at a folk festival in Asheville. He was a musician from up north, played the fiddle like he'd been born with it in his hands. "My father?" Nancy asked, barely breathing. Hazel nodded. His name was Daniel. Last name began with a K, but I can't recall it now. Keller, maybe. Something German. He was passing through, playing festivals across the South that summer. He and Gleaser had a whirlwind romance, the kind that burns bright and fast. By the time she realized she was expecting, he was long gone with no forwarding address. Did she try to find him? Some. But this was 1961. No internet, no cell phones. And deep down, I think she knew he wasn't coming back. He'd talked. About a girlfriend in Boston, though Gleaser had convinced herself it wasn't serious. Hazel sighed. When her condition became obvious, her parents were devastated. The Thorntons were respected in the community, devout Baptists. They pressured her to resolve the situation discreetly. "They forced her to give me up," Nancy said, a statement rather than a question. "It wasn't that simple," Hazel replied, her voice gentle with old sorrow. "Gleaser fought to keep you, had plans to move to Asheville and find work while raising you alone. But her father, your grandfather, was a hard man with traditional values. He told her she'd get no support from the family if she kept the child of sin, and with her college dreams already slipping away, with no money and no husband." Hazel's voice trailed off. "She felt she had no choice," Nancy finished quietly. "That's how she saw it at the time, a sacrifice for your benefit. The adoption agency promised her baby would go to a wealthy family who could provide opportunities she never could. But giving you up broke something in her, Nancy. She was never quite the same afterward." Nancy sat with this knowledge, trying to reconcile the young woman forced into an impossible choice with the mother whose voice she had never heard, whose embrace she had never felt. Not abandonment then, but a desperate kind of love. "What happened to her after?" "I found records of a tailor shop in Asheville." Hazel nodded. "Yes, she moved there right after the birth. Couldn't bear to stay in Hazelwood with the whispers and the memories. She started over, built that little business from nothing, never married, though I know she had suitors over the years." "Did she ever look for me?" Nancy asked, the question that had burned in her heart for months finally finding voice. Hazel's eyes filled with tears. "Every year on your birthday, she would light a candle and say a prayer for my baby girl in the big house by the sea. She had no idea where you were exactly, but the agency had told her your adoptive parents lived near the ocean. She tried to find you when you would have been 18, thinking you might be searching too, but the records were sealed, and she had no resources for a legal battle to open them." Nancy's heart seized painfully in her chest. While she had been celebrating her 18th birthday at the country club, surrounded by friends and family, Gleaser had been searching for her, hoping for a reunion that never came. "Is she—" Nancy couldn't bring herself to complete the question. Hazel reached across to take Nancy's hand. "She passed 12 years ago, honey. Breast cancer. It was quick at least. She didn't suffer long." The final hope that Nancy had barely allowed herself to acknowledge the possibility of meeting her birth mother evaporated. She would never know Gleaser's voice, never see the expressions that might mirror her own, never have the chance to tell her that she had built a good life, that the sacrifice had in its way achieved what Gleaser had hoped. "I have something for you," Hazel said, rising slowly from her chair. "I've kept it all these years, thinking someday it might find its way to where it belongs." She disappeared into another room, returning minutes later with a weathered cardboard. After Gleaser passed, I helped clear out her apartment. Most things went to charity, but this I couldn't bear to part with. Nancy opened the box with trembling hands. Inside lay a quilt, carefully folded. As she lifted it out, she gasped at the intricate craftsmanship. The pattern depicted a coastal scene, waves meeting shore, seabirds in flight, shells scattered. Along a beach, all rendered in fabrics whose colors had mellowed with age. It was the work of a master quilter, someone whose understanding of both technique and artistry transcended mere craft. "She made this for you," Hazel explained softly. "Started it when you would have been graduating high school. Worked on it for years. Every stitch was a prayer that someday you might have it. She called it Shore Dreams." Nancy traced the patterns with wondering fingers, recognizing techniques she herself had discovered through years of experimentation, never knowing they were part of her heritage. The borders of the quilt incorporated traditional Appalachian motifs, the same patterns she had always been inexplicably drawn to in her own work. "There's something else," Hazel added, reaching into the box and withdrawing an envelope, yellowed with age. "She wrote this the day you were born. Asked me to keep it in case you ever came looking." Nancy held the envelope as if it might dissolve in her hands. Her name, her original name, was written on the front in elegant script. "For Elizabeth. Grace, when she is ready." "Would you like some privacy?" Hazel asked gently. Nancy nodded, unable to speak past the emotion constricting her throat. Hazel squeezed her shoulder and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Alone with this treasure from the past, Nancy carefully opened the envelope, unfolding pages covered in the same graceful handwriting. "My dearest Elizabeth Grace, today I held you in my arms for the first and last time. You are perfect. 10. Tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and eyes that already seem to hold all the wisdom of the mountains that birthed us both. By the time you read this, if you ever do, you will have become someone else, with another name and another life far from these hills. But I want you to know that you were loved from your first flutter. You were wanted. You were the brightest star in my sky. I'm giving you up not because you aren't wanted, but because I want more for you than I can provide. They tell me you'll go to a couple by the ocean, educated people who can give you everything I cannot. Security, opportunity, acceptance. They promise you'll never know hunger or shame or the limitations that have defined my existence. If you are reading this, it means you've found your way back to these mountains, back to your beginnings. There are things I hope you'll know, things I pray have somehow traveled through blood and bone, even without my teaching. The Thornton women have always spoken through their hands. Our quilts tell stories that our lips sometimes cannot. When you piece a quilt, you are joining your voice to generations of women who came before you. Our family carries a gift for seeing patterns in chaos, for finding harmony in discord. It shows itself differently in each generation, in quilting, in music, in the way we arrange our lives. We come from people who bend, but do not break. There is steel in your spine and starlight in your soul. Whatever life has brought you, I know you have faced it with grace. I don't know if I'll ever see you again in this life. I don't know if I have the right to hope for it. But know that every April 12th I celebrate your birth. I imagine you growing, learning, becoming. I send love across whatever distance separates us and hope that somehow, somewhere you feel it. Whatever name you bear, whatever life you've lived, you will always be my Elizabeth Grace, my gift, my sacrifice, my enduring love. Your mother, Glyza Ann Thornton." Nancy wept then, for the mother she had never known and now would never know, for the years lost to secrecy and separation, for the young woman who had made the most painful choice a mother could make out of desperate love. She wept for her parents, Samuel and Catherine, who had kept this truth from her, perhaps out of fear that her heart might have room for 2 mothers, 2 identities, 2 loves. When Hazel returned, she said nothing about Nancy's tear-stained face, only pressed a handkerchief into her hand. "She would have been so proud of you," she said simply. "Glyza always had faith that you were out there, thriving. I wish I had known her," Nancy whispered. "I wish she could have known her grandchildren, seen what her sacrifice made possible." "She knew," Hazel assured her. "Not the details, but she had faith that you were living the life she dreamed for you." That brought her peace, especially toward the end. They talked for hours as the afternoon faded into evening. Hazel shared stories of Glyza's childhood, her talents, her dreams, her quiet determination to build a life on her own terms after the heartbreak of giving up her baby. Nancy learned that her birth mother had channeled her maternal instincts into mentoring young women in textile arts, creating a legacy of creativity in the community. She had lived simply but with purpose, her small apartment above her shop filled with books on textile history and art. "There's something else you should know," Hazel said as Nancy prepared to leave. "The quilt you're holding, it's not the only Thornton quilt you've encountered." Nancy looked at her questioningly. Gleiser did commission work for clients across the Southeast. In the late 80s, she was hired to create a special quilt for a charity auction in Newport, Rhode Island. Nancy's breath caught. "Newport? Where I live?" Hazel nodded, her eyes twinkling. The client was a historical preservation society. Gleiser designed a quilt featuring coastal scenes and maritime symbols. It was auctioned at some fancy event to raise funds for restoration work. Nancy's mind raced through memories of charity events she had attended or organized over the years. "The Whitmarsh House renovation," she breathed. 1989. "I chaired that committee. We auctioned artisan pieces to fund the restoration of a colonial home." "Did you see the quilt?" Hazel asked. "I bought it," Nancy whispered, the realization washing over her like a wave. "It hangs in my dining room to this day. I've always loved it. The craftsmanship, the colors. I never knew who made it. The auction catalogue only listed it as the work of an Appalachian artisan." The cosmic coincidence of it, that mother and daughter had connected through art without either knowing, felt like the universe offering a belated gift. For 36 years, Nancy had lived with her birth mother's creation in her home, admiring it daily, feeling an inexplicable connection to it that now made perfect sense. "Some threads can't be severed," Hazel said softly, "not even by time or distance or all the secrets people try to keep." As Nancy drove back to her bed and breakfast that evening, the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. She felt both emptiness and fullness, grief for what could never be, gratitude for what had been revealed. The quilt and letter rested carefully in the back seat, tangible connections to the woman who had given her life and then let her go. Tomorrow she would visit Asheville, walk the streets where Gleiser had built her life, perhaps even find the building that had housed her shop. But tonight, in this place where her life had begun, Nancy felt the first tendrils of peace taking root in her heart. The truth, even in its incompleteness, was infinitely preferable to the beautiful lies that had shaped her for 60 years. Back in her room, Nancy called Gordon, needing to share her discoveries with someone who would understand their significance without judgment. "I found her, Gordon," she said when he answered. "Not in person, she passed away 12 years ago. But I found her story, her work. I even met someone who knew her well." "Oh, Mum." Gordon's voice was warm with empathy. "I'm so glad you have answers, even if they're bittersweet. Tell me everything." Nancy recounted her day, the historical society, Hazel's revelations, the quilt, the letter, the extraordinary coincidence of having unknowingly purchased her birth mother's work decades earlier. Gordon listened without interruption, asking questions only when she paused for breath. "It's amazing," he said when she had finished, "like something from a novel. How are you feeling about it all?" Nancy considered the question seriously. "Sad that I'll never meet her, angry that I was denied the chance to know her all these years, but also as grateful. Grateful to know where I came from, to understand parts of myself that never made sense before, and strangely comforted to know she thought of me, that she wanted me even though circumstances made that impossible." "Do you think you'll tell Adam and Fiona? They've been calling me all day, worried about you." Nancy sighed, imagining her older children's reactions to these discoveries. "Yes, but not everything at once. They need time to adjust to the idea that our family story is more complicated than we thought. I'll start with the facts and let the emotions come later." "Wise approach," Gordon agreed. "And the quilt, will you bring it home?" "Yes," Nancy said without hesitation. "It belongs with me, with us. It's part of our heritage too, yours and your siblings and the grandchildren's, a piece of history that connects us to people we never knew we had." After talking with Gordon, Nancy prepared for bed, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she sat by the window, looking out at the mountains bathed in moonlight. Somewhere among these ancient hills, A teenage girl had given birth to her 60 years ago. Somewhere in a local cemetery, that same woman now rested, having lived a full life without ever reuniting with her daughter. Nancy unfolded the quilt across her lap, running her fingers over stitches made by hands that shared her DNA. In the intricate patterns, she could read a story of loss and longing, of a mother's enduring love reaching across decades. For the first time since her birthday celebration had shattered her sense of self, Nancy felt truly connected to her past, not the fabricated past she had believed in for 60 years, but the complex, painful, beautiful truth of her origins. Have you ever known someone who discovered an unexpected truth about their identity or origins? What happened? Let me know in the comments. The next morning, Nancy drove to Asheville with a new sense of purpose. Armed with the address of Thornton's Fine Alterations from City Records, she navigated to a charming street in the downtown area. The building that had once housed Gleiser's shop now contained a bookstore, but a plaque on the wall acknowledged the history of the structure, listing previous businesses. Nancy traced the engraved words, Thornton's Fine Alterations, 1963 to 1992, with her fingertip, imagining her birth mother climbing these same steps each morning, unlocking the door to the life she had built for herself. Inside the bookstore, Nancy introduced herself to the owner, explaining her connection to the previous tenant. The woman, fascinated by this personal history, invited Nancy to see the back room that had once been Gleiser's workroom. "The previous owner told me a master seamstress worked here," she said, leading Nancy to a sun-filled space. Apparently, she left marks on the hardwood floor from her cutting table and sewing machine. "We decided to keep them when we renovated. It felt like preserving a piece of the building's soul." Nancy knelt to touch the shallow indentations in the floor, imagining Gleiser standing in this same spot, bent over fabrics, creating beauty with her hands, just as Nancy herself had done throughout her life. The connection felt almost spiritual, as if some essence of her birth mother lingered in this space. "There was something else," the bookstore owner added, rummaging in a drawer. "When we bought the place, there was an old business card tucked behind a baseboard. The previous owner gave it to me because she thought it was neat historical ephemera." She handed Nancy a yellowed card bearing the shop's name in elegant script, with Gleiser's name printed beneath it. "Gleiser A. Thornton, Proprietor." Nancy accepted, the card with trembling hands, the first tangible object she had held that her birth mother had actually touched. "May I keep this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. It belongs with you." From the bookstore, Nancy made her way to the Asheville Public Library, where helpful staff directed her to archived local newspapers from the 1960s through the 1990s. There, on microfiche, she found occasional mentions of Gleiser, her shop's participation in a historic downtown preservation project, her workshops at the community college, her award-winning entries in regional textile exhibitions. Each discovery was another puzzle piece, forming a more complete picture of the woman who had given her life. In the late afternoon, Nancy visited the small cemetery where Hazel had told her Gleiser was buried. The caretaker directed her to a modest headstone beneath a flowering dogwood tree. The marker was simple: Gleiser Ann Thornton, 1943-2011. Her hands created beauty, her heart created love. Nancy placed a small bouquet of mountain wildflowers at the base of the stone, then stood in silence, uncertain what to say to the mother she had never known. Finally, she whispered, "I found my way back as you hoped I might. I've had a good life, the life you wanted for me. And now I know where I came from, who I came from. Thank you for the gift of life and for the courage to let me go." She remained by the grave until the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold, feeling a completeness she hadn't known was missing. Whatever anger she had harbored toward her adoptive parents for their deception had softened, replaced by understanding of the complex choices all parents make, biological and adoptive alike. Samuel and Catherine had given her love, security, and opportunity just as Gleiser had hoped. Their deception, while painful to discover, had come from a desire to protect her and to secure their bond as a family. As for Gleiser, Nancy now understood that her birth mother's choice had been an act of desperate love rather than abandonment. In different circumstances, in a more forgiving time, perhaps they could have remained mother and daughter. But in the Iwimei world as it was then, Gleezer had made the only choice she felt she could. On her final evening in North Carolina, Nancy received an unexpected call from Adam. "Gordon told us some of what you've discovered," he began, his voice unusually hesitant. I wanted to check if you're okay." Nancy settled onto the bed in her room, touched by her pragmatic son's concern. "I'm more than okay, Adam. I've found answers I needed even if they weren't the ones I imagined." He mentioned a quilt, and that Gleezer was an artist? Nancy smiled at his careful navigation of this new terminology. "Yes, it turns out my affinity for textile arts wasn't random after all. It's quite literally in my blood. And that Newport quilt, the one from the charity auction, was actually made by her? That's quite a coincidence." "It feels like more than coincidence," Nancy admitted. "It feels like some part of me recognized some part of her, even across all that distance and ignorance." Adam was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about knowledge, being better than lies even when it hurts. I think I understand that better now. This truth has given you something, hasn't it? Something important." "Yes," Nancy confirmed, grateful for his effort to understand. "It hasn't erased who I was or who raised me. It's just completed the picture, added depth and context to my understanding of myself." "Well, your grandson has something he wants to add to that picture," Adam said, his tone lightening. "Tyler has been working on a family tree project for school. When he heard about your discoveries, he asked if he could include your birth family, if that's okay with you." Nancy felt tears spring to her eyes at this small but significant acceptance from her family. "I'd like that very much. Tell him I'll bring back stories about the Thorntons that he can add to his project. He'll be thrilled. And Mom, we miss you. Come home soon." After they hung up, Nancy sat for a long time reflecting on the journey she had undertaken. What had begun with a shattered champagne glass and a devastating revelation had led her to this mountaintop, to connections she had never imagined, to a deeper understanding of herself and those who had shaped her. Tomorrow she would begin the journey home to Newport, carrying with her Gleezer's quilt, her letter, and the 1,000 threads of heritage that had always been part of her, even when she didn't know it. She would integrate these new truths into her life, finding ways to honor both the family who had chosen her and the woman who had given her life. As she packed her suitcase, carefully wrapping the quilt that would travel with her, Nancy felt a strange sensation, as if invisible hands guided hers, as if knowledge long dormant in her blood had awakened. The patterns and connections that had always existed were finally visible to her, the quilt of her life, intricate and beautiful in its complexity. Nancy returned to Newport on a perfect spring day, the coastal light shimmering across the water as she drove the familiar route to her home. The dogwoods she had planted decades earlier were in full bloom, their white flowers brilliant against the blue sky. As she pulled into her driveway, she was surprised to see 3 cars parked there, one belonging to each of her children. They were waiting for her on the porch, an impromptu welcome committee that brought tears to her eyes. Fiona rushed forward to embrace her, while Gordon took her suitcase and Adam held open the door. "We thought you might like some company for your first night back," Fiona explained as they ushered Nancy inside. "And maybe, if you felt like it, you could tell us about what you discovered." The house had been cleaned, fresh flowers arranged in vases throughout the main rooms. On the dining room table, beneath the quilt that Nancy now knew had been created by her birth mother's hands, a simple meal waited. "You didn't have to do all this," Nancy said, touched by their effort. "We wanted to," Gordon replied. "We've been talking while you were gone, about family, about truth, about how sometimes the stories we tell ourselves need revision." Over dinner, Nancy shared her discoveries: the meeting with Hazel, the revelation of Gleezer's sacrifice, the letter, the astonishing coincidence of the auction quilt. She spoke of the bookstore that now occupied her birth mother's shop and the cemetery beneath the dogwood trees. As she talked, she watched her children's expressions shift from polite interest to genuine engagement, questions flowing more naturally as the evening progressed. "I'd like to see the quilt she made for you," Fiona said when Nancy mentioned the gift Hazel had given her. Nancy retrieved it from her suitcase, carefully unfolding it across the living room floor. Her children gathered around, admiring the craftsmanship that had gone into creating the coastal scene. "It's remarkable," Adam observed, kneeling to examine the stitching. "The attention to detail, the precision. It's exactly like your work, Mom." "I was thinking the same about these seashells," Fiona added, pointing to a section of the quilt. "Remember that pillow you made for my beach house? The techniques are identical." Nancy had noticed the same similarities, these echoes of inherited talent that had expressed themselves despite separation and secrecy. "I've been thinking about teaching a quilting class at the senior center," she said, sharing these traditional techniques that were passed down through the Thornton family. "It feels like the right way to honor Gleeser's memory." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Gordon said. "And maybe we could plan a family trip to the Blue Ridge next summer. See the area where the Thorntons came from, show the grandkids another piece of their heritage." The suggestion, so casual yet so profound in its acceptance of this new branch of their family story, moved Nancy deeply. "I'd love that," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Later, as her children prepared to leave, each hugged her with a new understanding. What had begun as a personal quest had transformed into a family journey, expanding rather than diminishing their connections to each other. Alone in her house that night, Nancy hung Gleeser's quilt on the wall, opposite the one her birth mother had unknowingly created for her decades earlier. The two pieces seemed to speak to each other across the room, across time, different in style, but united by the hands that had created them, by the heritage they represented. Nancy stood between them, 60 years of life behind her, and whatever remained ahead no longer divided but whole. She was Nancy Davis Crawford, daughter of Samuel and Catherine, mother to Adam, Fiona, and Gordon, grandmother to 5 wonderful children. And she was also Elizabeth Grace Thornton, daughter of Gleeser, descendant of mountain quilters, inheritor of talents that had expressed themselves throughout her life without her understanding their source. Both truths could exist together. Both stories were hers to claim. In the months that followed, Nancy's relationship with her children deepened as they integrated these new understandings into their family narrative. Tyler proudly presented his expanded family tree at school, including a branch for the Thorntons of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Fiona helped Nancy organize her quilting class at the senior center, where Nancy shared techniques she now recognized as part of her Appalachian heritage. Adam, ever practical, assisted Nancy in creating a small foundation to support textile arts education in both Newport and Hazelwood, connecting the two communities that had shaped her. The quilt that Gordon had casually suggested became a reality the following summer, with 3 generations of the family exploring the mountains where Nancy had been born. They visited Hazel, who delighted in meeting Nancy's children and grandchildren, sharing stories of Gleeser that helped them understand this newfound branch of their family history. They hiked trails dotted with rhododendron blooms, attended a folk music festival where fiddle music reminded Nancy of the musician who had been her father, and visited local quilting exhibitions where the Thornton name was still remembered with a respect. On Nancy's 61st birthday there was another garden party, but this one felt different. Among the decorations were elements that honored both sides of her heritage, her adoptive mother's cherished roses alongside mountain wildflowers, seafood from the Newport coast served with Appalachian cornbread and apple butter. The birthday cake was decorated with an edible image of 2 intertwined quilting patterns, one from the coastal traditions of Rhode Island, one from the mountains of North Carolina. And most significantly, displayed on an easel was a new family portrait, not a photograph but a quilt Nancy had created over the past year. Into its design, she had incorporated symbols of both her families, the Davis family's sailing motifs alongside Thornton quilting patterns, coastal landscapes merging with mountain vistas. Every stitch represented the integration of her dual heritage, the wholeness she had finally achieved. As she stood before her assembled family and friends, Nancy felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had begun in pain but ended in understanding. The truth even discovered late, had been a gift beyond measure, not just to her but to the generations that would follow, who would now know their full heritage and the remarkable women whose choices, sacrifices and love had shaped their existence. "Last year at this time," Nancy said, addressing her guests, "I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was wrong, but in discovering that, I found a more complete truth. We are all shaped by forces we may not understand, by the choices of those who came before us, by talents written in our blood, by connections that exist whether we recognize them or not. I stand before you today as the sum of all these parts, grateful for each thread in the tapestry that has become my life." Her gaze moved to the quilt she had created, to the faces of her children and grandchildren, to the photograph of Glyza that now held a place of honor among her family pictures, to the golden roses that her adoptive mother had loved. All of it was her inheritance, her legacy, her truth. "We are all," she concluded softly, "the product of love in its many forms, the love that raises us, the love that lets us go when necessary, the love that seeks truth even when it's difficult, the love that accepts us for all that we are and all that we come from. That is the greatest gift I could receive at 61, the knowledge that I have been loved completely by more people than I ever knew." As the gathering applauded, Nancy felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a shattered glass and a whispered secret had led her to a more authentic understanding of herself and her place in the world. The deception that had shaped her life had been painful to discover, but the truth had ultimately set her free. To embrace all aspects of her identity, to honor all those who had contributed to her existence, and to pass this integrated heritage to the generations that would follow. In the quilt of Nancy's life, every stitch had purpose, every pattern meaning, every thread essential to the whole. And in that completeness, she had found the peace that comes from truly knowing oneself, from embracing the complex tapestry of identity that makes each human story unique and precious. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.